All right, so to pick up where we left off with the Shang Dynasty, I hear my son moving around a little bit in there. So if I ever misspeak or seem like I'm out of thought process, it's because I'm trying to listen for him. So again, I do apologize just for the makeshift way that I'm doing this video this semester. Hopefully, semesters in the future will work out a little bit better. However, the Shang Dynasty, circa 1500 to about 1050 BCE, this dynasty saw major capital cities develop throughout China in its long reign. Anyang is one such capital. It was used for roughly 200 years by Shang rulers, again, built primarily out of wood, so not a lot of it left standing. The large temples and buildings imply its importance. So again, pretty common thing throughout history and archaeology. You look at the type of buildings in a certain area, and if they're large and impressive, then you can assume that the city was, fairly important. The houses were arranged around a central government run point. So again, we see that city built in rings at this time is kind of a common concept. You have the central point, which is your government center. And then you have outside of that, depending on where we're looking, government buildings, so to speak, bureaucratic buildings. Outside of that, you would have houses. Outside of that, factories and workplaces, et cetera, et cetera. So around the government core, in this case in China, they had factories, artisans, metalworks for bronze, etc. The tombs of the city speak to the military status of one of the rulers. So, by interpreting some writings that are on tombs, we can determine a lot about the society at the time. Chiefs of this time would send out large armies to capture and hunt for food so that they could grow their capital and, the number of people in it. Slaves and bounty were the main sources of income for these rulers. So again, go out, conquer people, enslave them, bring them back, take their goods and use them for your own purposes. Around 1200 BCE, chariots and bronze metalworking aided in the spread of Chinese culture throughout the area. Religious status also played into a chief's rule. So again, we see in China a very strong relationship between the state and the church, even back to 1500 BCE in the Shang Dynasty. Shang rulers would read bones and interpret dreams, both I guess fortune telling, shaman type things that we have talked about in previous chapters. They communed with their ancestors and the divine. And this, again, helped to solidify the Shang rulers' place in power. Not that they weren't ever questioned, but, you tie the religious to the political, and it's a pretty strong tie to control people. Much of this culture's architecture, again, has been lost to time in the elements. Many of the tombs have been raided, so what we do know from the one tomb I spoke of earlier is, not unique, but certainly rare. However, one tomb, the tomb of a Lady Ho, who was I forget if she was a wife or they just mentioned her as a concubine of the emperor around 1200 BCE. This tomb held a cache of invaluable artifacts made out of jade, ivory, again, bronze, very, very, very fine work. And they also buried alive her people that were supposed to be the attendants of her afterlife. So she was dead, put in the tomb, and then the living people who were there to take care of her spirit in the afterlife were entombed alive with her. That's a common practice that we see into the, throughout the Shang and I believe into the Zhao dynasty or Zhou dynasty. I always mispronounce that. It's the Zhou dynasty, spelled Zhou. So forgive me. However, back to the point. Shang society. It's a very patrilineal society. Again, we've talked about this through many of the other cultures. Very patrilineal time. Governments also followed, family, eldest son typically would follow in line for power. Slaves were owned by royals and nobles at this time. So, slaveholding society. These slaves provided the workforce for some of the, most lasting projects. They also were some of the finest artisans. So you have a lot of these goods that we attribute with Chinese society being made by slaves at this point. Farmers still worked as kind of serf tenants to their land. They were tied to their land in that respect. They served a landlord and lived in small villages throughout the kingdom. So again, north you had more millet production. South you tended to have more rice paddy production. But throughout time, you'll see the move of those two products throughout north and south, etc. Another heavy influencer and a way that we get a lot of our history about Shang China is through the bronze metalwork that they left. Their skill set, again, in a lot of ways, what you do as a profession dictated where you stood in society. We see, the charioteers, the people who rode in chariots and shot bows, famed archers, came out of the noble class at this time, or the Warring States period, which is later into the chapter. And that was very much, they had the status. They were wealthy enough to afford a chariot. They had trained for a long time to do it, and their standing, went up with that skill set. Metalworking at this time was especially respected in China. Their works established some of the Shang practices, iconic features such as the artistic representation of a monstrous face called the Totai, and stylized animals feature heavily in the art of the Shang. You still see that commonly now in references to Chinese art. A lot of the Totai and animal features you'll see running throughout the artistic practices there that people associate with China. At this time in Europe, though, it's a very different focus in art. It's a lot more, I want to say religious as well, but it's also a lot more historical in representations of what art was. It was meant to convey actual events typically, or actual people. This is much more stylized, so different feel to the art entirely. Now, as I spoke of earlier, the development of writing in China is very unique. Like the Egyptians and Mesopotamian scripts, ancient Chinese is considered a logographic language. This means that each word is depicted by a specific symbol, and unlike other languages that began as logographic languages, Chinese never evolved or changed into a phonetic language. So, phonetic language, right? Where symbols and alphabet dictate sounds, and those sounds and symbols become the base for all words of a phonetic language, right? Phonetic languages can be more accessible to those without extensive education. Education, like that in Chinese society, was an exclusive realm of like elites and nobles or slaves that became scribes. Oop, let me get through this section very quickly, and then I gotta stop again and go and take care of the baby boy. So, the use of writing by governments and elites, etc., did allow for extensive record keeping and distant communications, via the road network that had already been established in China. This type of language also has the feature of being easily translatable between different spoken languages. Though spoken differently, Chinese characters are written in the same forms between the different spoken languages. So even though they sound different, they are, the use of the Chinese language in different developing societies that develop their own spoken language, those core symbols still mean the same thing regardless of how they're spoken. So a person who can read ancient Chinese would be able to translate between the spoken languages. It's a very good feature. All right, so again, I apologize for having to cut this one short and make it a short video, but I'll make another one in a few minutes after I take care of my son. Hope it helps.